All right. Looks like we got it up and running now. Okay, I'm just going to give a couple more seconds for some folks to pull in here. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, most of you have been to some of my webinars before, but a little background on me. I've worked in the oil and gas industry, the construction industry, as well as manufacturing, and I do a lot of training for confined space and fall protection lately. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to talk about PPE and machine guarding and then just a little bit on the basics of lockout, tagout today. We're going to go over some requirements of L&I, such as the PPE hazard assessments for all employers. That's one thing that I see a lot of places I go that hasn't been completed, and L&I will issue citations for that if they see that you don't have those completed. So we'll go over those PPE hazard assessments as well. Some requirements for PPE. These are directly from Washington Labor and Industry. That standard is the WAC code 296-800-160. And that tells us that we have to do a hazard assessment, as I mentioned, for PPE, and we need to document that and keep that on file. We also need to select and provide appropriate PPE to employees based off of that assessment that we do. And then we need to train our employees on the PPE, the personal protective equipment that we're giving them. Everything from safety glasses to gloves to things that are more complex like arc flash gear. And then we need to make sure they use it properly. A lot of people, they'll start out with step one, they'll do that, and then some people will stop there and think that they're done. Some other employers will move on to these next two steps, and then once we get there, they'll stop after they train their employees to use it. But that's not where this stops. We need to make sure that we keep going and have a program in place, and that we're going out and making sure the employees are continuing to use it properly. This goes with any safety rule or policy that your company puts in place. You can't just do it and train it and let it go. You then need to go back and audit or observe and make sure that it's being followed. And then we also need to make sure that our PPE is in safe and good condition. This is especially important for respirators. Those of you, I know we have some manufacturers that registered for this webinar that do use respirators. If you're using a respirator, you need to make sure that they're not being used past when they would be done. So for example, if your workers are experiencing breakthrough where they can start smelling the contaminant through the respirator, that's no good anymore. Some respirators are kind of one and done. You use them for a day and they're done, and other ones you can use a little bit longer. So you need to make sure you're reading the manufacturer's instructions on those and adhering to those. An important thing to note before I do go any further is PPE alone should not be relied on as protection for your employees. It's really a last resort. We should be doing other things to reduce the hazards beforehand. We need to identify the hazards, and then we need to take steps to get rid of all those identified hazards. For example, we can consider other ways to get a job done. We can substitute out dangerous products. We can reduce the amount of hazardous materials or processes, or we can apply engineering controls to reduce or eliminate hazards. And we'll talk about those engineering controls when we get to machine guarding. And then also in December, we have scheduled a hazard identification and prevention webinar as well, which will go beyond just PPE. So where do we start with PPE. We mentioned the hazard assessments, and those are required for every employer. It doesn't matter if you're in an office building, a fast food place, a manufacturing plant, or an oil refinery. Every employer in the state of Washington needs to have hazard assessments, and those are required by 296-800-16010. In all these standards I'm putting out, if you just type WAC and then that number into Google, you'll be able to pull up the full standard on each one of these. It'll be right on Washington L&I's website. Those hazard assessments do need to be documented, and there's two different options to complete them. If you're a small employer or you're an employer with very few hazards, let's say you're in an office building, a credit union, something like that, you're going to go probably with just the first option, which is just a simple hazard assessment for PPE. This is where we're going to identify hazards by the body parts they would affect. They're good for retail and non-manufacturing businesses with very few hazards, as I mentioned. But they're not very detailed, and therefore they're not going to be very adequate for our manufacturing group. So those of you that are in here from the manufacturing group, you're going to need something probably a little more robust. You're going to need a job hazard analysis that includes the hazard assessment for PPE. Some of you have probably heard the term job hazard analysis, or JHA, before. That's when we break each individual job in our facility into its tasks. So let's take, for example, a janitor. We would write a job hazard analysis for all of our janitors. And examples of tasks for the janitors would be mopping, which we could have bodily reaction type claims where they could slip or trip, fall hazards, things like that. And then we have other things those janitors are doing, such as wiping down a window or wiping down a surface while they're using a chemical that they're spraying. And so in that case, we would look at respiratory and eye hazards, as well as skin absorption hazards. So it depends on the chemical they're working with. But we're going to essentially break down that person's job into each task that they do, and we're going to look at each hazard that's associated with each task and how are we going to protect it. And then we'll assign a risk priority code. That's basically saying we use a matrix that says this could lead to a minor injury and it's likely to happen or unlikely to happen. Okay, and we're going to rank those dangers. These are good for detailed analysis of hazards that are associated with a job or a task, and they provide a description of how you do the job, but they require a lot more resource and time. Usually you're going to have a consultant come out and do those, or you're going to have a safety professional do those. There's a couple different ways you can go about it. These job hazard analysis, the second option, can also be useful for training new workers on job procedures. When I was working on the pipeline, I would actually pull the job hazard analysis for whatever the new employee's job was. Let's say they were a pipe fitter. I would pull the job hazard analysis for the pipe fitter, and I would go over it with them and explain the hazards of each task that they're going to be required to do. These are also helpful for accident investigations because you can pull one of these out and see if policies were violated, things like that. And they're also good for ADA use to determine reasonable accommodation. In other words, if you have a new hire that's coming in and has a disability, you can pull the job hazard assessment and see if there are any tasks on there that they're going to have difficulty doing. And if so, we can then start to alter those tasks to assist that person and make sure that we can get them a reasonable accommodation for their job. So a job hazard analysis is very helpful just to have on hand. It's also more detailed than a job description. So sometimes it's even better to send a job hazard analysis to a doctor than the actual job description, because a lot of times job descriptions are very generic. So the hazard assessment, I do have an example of one of those. I'm going to pull it up now. It's a separate file, and this file is actually located on our website, the Compwise Safety Library website, which I will have the link to. It'll be on the very last slide we have. I'll share that link with you. but it's the same place you go to register for these webinars. And actually, right underneath this webinar, we have this attachment there. If you can't find this webinar posted there anymore, you can also go to the Toolbox Talk library, and you'll find this hazards assessment for PPE posted there as well, along with a lot of other helpful safety topics and documents. You can also get this right off of Washington L&I's website. This is actually Washington L&I's document. Okay. So this first page just walks you through how to do it and gives you some instructions. Basically what we're going to do is we're going to walk through and do a survey of each job task. And again, this is option 1. This is just the hazard assessment, not the full JHA. And these are mandatory. You don't necessarily have to use this form from L&I, but this is going to be a form that they're not going to question if you do use it. Okay, so we're going to walk in to our workplace and we're going to look at each job. So as we walk up to, let's say, somebody working in a conveyor belt area, we're going to say, what work activities are you doing? Actually, let's use a maintenance professional. Maintenance professionals are good for these because they kind of have some of the most complex work. So we'll do the name of our workplace, the address, who conducted the assessment, the work areas they're going to be in, and then we're going to look at each individual, basically, part on the body that could be injured. So the first thing it asks about is eyes. So is our maintenance worker doing any welding or any abrasive blasting, any sanding, grinding, hammering? Chances are they are. A lot of people don't really look at hammering and think of an eye hazard, but if you're swinging a hammer and there's anything there that it could hit other than a nail, let's say there's just even dust laying around, that can send stuff up into your eye area. So any of those work-related activities, we're going to check if they do them. And then also if they have work-related exposure to any of these types of things over here. So a maintenance guy sometimes gets tasked with cleanup as well if you don't have a janitor, or it's cleanup of maybe a chemical that's spilt that you don't want the janitors handling. Our maintenance guy is going to go out and handle it. So hazardous liquid chemicals, we were talking about spraying a window or wiping down a window with a chemical. You should be wearing safety glasses when you use something like that, or put side shields on normal glasses when you're spraying chemicals like that. Also, if they're doing any of the other things over here that we talked about, any cutting, any abrasive blasting, again, you need some sort of PPE there, because we're not going to be able to eliminate it without PPE on some of those. Okay. And if we come down and we keep going down here, you're going to see, I'm not going to go through every single one of these. I'm going to go through some of the more common ones, but let's look at head injuries. So are they going to have any exposure to pipes? Probably. If they're a maintenance worker, they're going to be getting up on a ladder working around pipes and things like that. So we're going to want them to have some sort of protective helmet, probably just a bump cap or a type C, depending on what they're doing. Okay, and then even your regular line workers, they might be walking under certain things. Okay. Let's take a look here. What else can we look at? I know we did have some food service vendors that registered for this one. So are we doing anything such as frying if we're using an oil fryer? Okay, what can we do to handle that? We could get, an apron or something like that, but what about their hands? We're going to have rubber gloves when we're working with those fryers. If we're going to be actually doing any work on the fryers, such as repairs or draining them and moving that oil around where it could really splash, we're going to want to get all that on. Okay. But one of the biggest things we do need to look at is, can the hazard be eliminated without the use of PPE? That question is asked on every single one of these. If we can eliminate it without PPE, that's what we want to do. That would be putting engineering controls in place and things like that. So if we have an area where, let's say, our fingers could get cut, well, is there a way to make sure our fingers don't ever get near the point of operation? That's where we're going to start talking about machine guarding later, and that's where we'll be able to say, yeah, we can prevent that. We can put guards in place to keep our hands from getting near the point of operation. And that's what we're going to focus on doing. But if we're in a kitchen using knives, well, we can't really do much to keep our hands away from that point of operation, so maybe we should be using cut-resistant gloves. Okay. So this is a good document to use. A lot of times, some of these body parts aren't going to be affected in any of your jobs, and that's fine. Maybe you work in an office building, you don't really need any PPE for your typical jobs, but only the janitor and the maintenance worker need PPE. That's fine, but you still need to complete this for all types of jobs. So you could just lump a bunch of them into an administrative category, and for the administrative category, you can pretty much end up with no hazards that are needing anything. Okay, so I'm going to get this out of the way for now, and we're going to come back here. That was just, again, an example of that hazard assessment. You need to make sure you review your hazard assessments routinely. I recommend every year, and update it whenever there are changes in your workplace. And those types of changes would be job or task changes, new equipment, new jobs, or if there's been an accident. So maybe you did the PPE hazard assessment. Now, 6 months later, we have an incident or an injury to a worker. We're going to pull that hazard assessment out and say, what injured this worker, and did we consider it in our hazard assessment? If not, we need to update it to add that hazard. Excuse me. Even if no changes have been made to a job, you might find hazards that you've missed in the previous analysis, so it's always good to go back out and do these on a routine basis. And after you do your first one, maybe you have your safety committee go out and conduct the follow-up assessments. A good way to apply your safety committee there. All right, so once you do that hazard assessment, you're going to need to select the PPE that you need to use. Okay, if PPE is determined necessary, we're going to have to go out and seek that PPE and get it into the workplace. The PPE needs to also be of safe design and construction for the work that you're doing. Sometimes PPE can create a greater danger, especially gloves. If the use of a glove is going to make it harder to do the job and possibly more likely for the worker to get injured, then maybe we're going to have to do this without gloves and find another way to control that hazard. This includes PPE for head protection, eye and face protection, hand and arm protection, foot and leg protection, and torso protection as well. And PFDs if any of you are working around water. I don't think I've worked with any clients yet in Washington that are dealing with many water hazards. Okay. Once you pick that PPE out, you probably shouldn't do it on your own either. You should likely get some input from your workers as well, because they're the ones that are going to have to use it. So we don't want to go out and buy the $1.99 safety glasses. Maybe we need to get some slightly nicer safety glasses so that the workers use them. Also, where are the workers working at? Are they indoors or outdoors? If they're outdoors and they wear sunglasses a lot, they're not going to wear your clear safety glasses. But if you get them a pair of shaded safety glasses that cost a little bit more, they're going to be more likely to wear those. So we want to make sure it's PPE that's durable, it fits snugly to assure maximum protection and comfort, and that it doesn't interfere with the employee's movements. I run into this a lot with fall protection. There are workers that have very strong preferences on what lanyard or personal fall limiter they're going to use because they just simply do not like getting caught up in their equipment, and it makes their job harder. And then also, PPE is not one size fits all. You can't just order a box of gloves and expect everyone to fit in the large sized glove. Some people might have hands that are too large, and others are going to have hands that are too small, and that's where you start to create more of a hazard by putting the PPE on them, is when it doesn't fit properly. Okay, something that doesn't fit proper could get caught in moving machine parts and cause a greater hazard and actually cause someone to get pulled into the machine itself. And then we need to, as I said earlier, actually train our workers to use the PPE. I can't tell you how many times, especially with fall protection, I walk on job sites, and probably the most common thing I see is going to be workers that are using fall protection. They have a full body harness on, which is great. We don't want body belts anymore. Those are illegal to use for fall arrest. You can still use them for restraint, which is often misapplied as well. But they'll have that full body harness on, and then they'll have a 4-foot long lanyard to 6-foot long lanyard, somewhere in there. Usually it's a 6-foot long lanyard. And then they'll have a 4-foot shock absorber inside there. and they'll be using it 10 feet off the ground. Well, the problem there is we take that 6-foot lanyard, we had the 4-foot shock absorber, we're already at 10 feet and we haven't added the worker's height yet. So that fall protection is not going to do anything. They're going to fall, it's going to deploy, and they're going to be on the ground already. It's not going to stop them from hitting the ground. So that's one of the big limitations of that type of equipment. There are different ways that you can train your employees. You can provide your own training, especially for simple, straightforward PPE, where you basically just go over the manufacturer's instructions for that PPE and how it relates to the tasks that your workers are going to have to do. Make sure you document that you went through this training with them. You can borrow safety and health videos from L&I's video library, which is online, or other resources. We have plenty of not PPE resources yet on the Compwise website, but we have plenty of safety resources on our website. L&I has a lot of resources. YouTube has a lot of resources. But videos aren't always the best way to go anymore. Sometimes they can be used as supplemental material, but really your best thing to do is go out there hands-on, show them the PPE, how to put it on, how to take it off, and talk about its limitations. It doesn't have to be a long drawn out thing. We're talking about a 5 to 10 minute training on basic PPE. You can also call your local L&I office's consultation services for free. Washington L&I can send somebody out. You can contact me for certain types of training, and we can discuss that as well. And that would be an example of seeking an outside consultant that specializes in safety and health training. That's one of the things that I do. The training does need to be customized to the particular process and the hazards at your workplace, and it must be documented. As I said before, you have to talk about how it applies to the work that they're doing. You can't just say, this is a glove, this is how you put it on. You need to tell them what tasks they need to be using those gloves for, or whatever the PPE itself is. And then, of course, retraining. This is one thing that many employers lack doing. You need to make sure you retrain an employee whose work habits or demonstrated knowledge indicates a lack of understanding to use PPE. In other words, you walk out and they're not wearing their safety glasses, or they have their hard hat on backwards, or they're using the wrong fall arrest equipment. They don't have their harness adjusted properly. All of those things require retraining, not just write them up, not just look the other way. You need to make sure you retrain those employees to do it correctly, and if they continue to be defiant in that, you need to then start writing them up, suspending them, or replacing them. You also need to retrain anytime something in the workplace will make previous training out of date. So let's say you did training on an order picker that you have to use fall restraint on, and then you go and get a new order picker that has a fully guardrailed platform that the employee can't get out of at all. Now they don't need to even use the PPE anymore, maybe. You need to retrain on that equipment, or maybe explain, hey, this new one you don't need it, the old one you do. And then you have to go back out, like I said before, and audit that and make sure it's happening. Also, anytime you have changes in the types of PPE that you're using that makes previous training out of date, so maybe you find a glove that's more appropriate for a task, or you find just any sort of PPE that's made more specific for the task that you're doing, and maybe the stuff you used before offered some level of protection, but now you have something that's better. You need to let employees know that so that they're using the new thing and not the old one. And finally, enforcement. I talked about this briefly already. Make sure your employees are using the required PPE properly and are following the policies and procedures that you've put in place. You've put those in place for a reason. They need to be there. Your employees need to follow those. Your supervisors or lead workers should be regularly monitoring this. This is not something that HR needs to be doing. It's not something a safety professional needs to be doing. Enforcement of PPE policies should be managers and supervisors. Okay, if you have a staff safety professional that's making anywhere from 60 to 150,000 a year, enforcing PPE rules is not that safety professional's job. They're there to write the policy. They're there to make sure you have the best safety equipment. And yeah, they're there to enforce the policies, but that's not what they're there to do all day, every day. That type of responsibility should be delegated to managers and supervisors. That's the whole purpose of a manager and a supervisor, is to make sure policies are being followed and employees are being safe and productive. Safety is everybody's job, and at different levels these responsibilities fall. Make sure you provide follow-up training if necessary to ensure that each employee has the adequate skill, knowledge, and ability to use his or her PPE. And then coming back to that second one, maybe a supervisor is not enforcing the correct use and care of PPE by their employees. Um, I see this a lot. I'll go out and I'll see maybe certain groups of workers that aren't using safety glasses. I ran into this on the pipeline. It was always my journeymen who I would catch with their safety glasses hanging on their shirt instead of on their face. And so I got to the point where I started asking, hey, why aren't you wearing your safety glasses all the time? Oh, I forgot to put them back on after I lined up the pipe. And so what I realized was a lot of them had to take their glasses off to see very clearly what they wanted to do and how they wanted to line the pipe up. This was fixed by actually getting some of the safety glasses that had like a, I don't know if they're called a bifocal lens, but it was like a slightly zoomed in generic lens at the bottom of the safety glasses where they could see things better. And so once I got them those, they didn't take off those safety glasses anymore. So the PPE was getting in the way of the work they were doing, so we had to find a creative workaround for that. And that was simply getting them better PPE for the tasks that they were doing. Okay, make sure you have a disciplinary policy and also focus on engaging employees. The more you can engage an employee, the more likely they are to adhere to PPE rules and regulations. We have a whole webinar. It's one of my favorite webinars is the employee engagement webinar that we did, I think it was a couple months ago, but it is up on our safety library website and you're able to access it at any time. Okay, and ultimately what we want is a safety culture where, again, HR and safety professionals don't have to worry about enforcing the little things like PPE because the employees should be policing themselves on it and reminding each other when they see someone deficient in that. Okay, and then PPE does not last forever. It needs to be inspected before each use, and it needs to be cleaned and maintained according to manufacturer's recommendations and instructions. Violations I see here would be harnesses that are ripped or torn, harnesses that have rust on the D-rings and the metal pieces, as well as PPE past an expiration date. If you look inside a hard hat, most hard hats have expiration dates. Also hard hats that are being used that are painted over, that's not allowed. And then with safety glasses, if the safety glasses are all scuffed up because the workers had them for a while, they get put in a toolbox, they get beat around, they need replaced because if they're scuffed up and they can't see out of them, either the worker's not going to be able to see and that's going to cause them to get hurt, or the worker's just simply not going to wear them anymore because they can't see out of them. Make sure you're discarding any defective personal protective equipment unless you're going to keep it for training purposes, such as keeping a damaged harness to teach workers how to inspect harnesses. If that's the case, I recommend you cut off at least the back D-ring so they can't attach it to anything, and put a tag on it that says do not use defective equipment for training only, and you make sure that you store that in a locked place where workers can't get to it. And that last note's important. Defective equipment can be worse than no PPE at all. Um, I always fall back to fall protection because that's my niche. That's my subject matter expert area. With fall protection, I've seen too many deaths that involved failure to inspect the equipment. There was either a rip in a lanyard or perhaps there was rust inside of a self-retracting lanyard. Some people call those yo-yos. I've seen multiple fatalities involving fall protection equipment where it simply came back to the equipment was not inspected properly. All equipment is going to fail eventually. It's going to fail inspection eventually. And we need to be doing inspections in order to catch that, and we need to do those before use every shift. All right. So that's about it on just the PPE. When we talk about PPE, let's talk about a couple different things that you can get. So steel-toed shoes come to mind. If you have a crush chance or something that large that could fall on a foot, you also want to get metatarsal guards. Those are large and bulky, and employees typically don't like them. But most people don't have a need for metatarsal guards. As far as the eye and face area, safety glasses are good. But if you're doing any grinding or going to have a lot of sparks going around, you should also have a face shield. If we talk about the top of the head, obviously a hard hat, and there are many varieties of hard hats. It depends on whether you're going to be really doing electrical work or not, which class hard hat to get. And then also something people don't think about is cold weather gear. I know we have a lot of employers that have refrigerated areas for food storage. You need to have cold weather gear for areas like that, like Refrigerware makes jackets for working in those types of environments. And also just letting employees know they should dress in layers if they're going to be working in different areas. Bring a jacket, bring a hoodie, have that type of stuff. And then also high vis equipment. I didn't have a slide specifically on high visibility equipment, but if you have a chance of being struck by anything moving, such as equipment like a forklift or vehicles, construction vehicles, trucks, loading docks, you need to have high visibility gear, and it needs to be outside of all your other gear. One of my faux pas when I was on the pipeline was when it was warm out, I'd take my jacket off and put my high vis vest on, and then when it'd start to get chilly, I'd put my jacket back on. One time I forgot to take my vest off and put it on the outside, and I was walking around with a black jacket on a construction site, and it did not take long for those workers to notice the safety guy didn't have his high vis on. So making sure that high vis is the outermost garment is great. One of the best ways to do that is instead of using safety vests, like have the safety vest, but instead have reflective shirts, just the regular cotton t-shirt with reflective stripes, and then also provide reflective jackets to your workers if they're going to be needing that stuff every day. That way, when they take the jacket off, they still have high vis on. When they put the jacket on, they still have high vis on without having to remember that vest. Okay. If anyone has any specific questions on any specific type of PPE, you can email me at any time, john.valentine@yorkrisks.com, or you can type in the comment box beside this video, the chat box. But I'm going to move on from PPE and we're going to head on over to machine guarding for those of you that have machine guarding needs. And then part of the machine guarding, we're going to talk about lockout, tagout, the basic level lockout, tagout, and what we need to know. So there are many standards that are encompassed within machine guarding. We're not going to go through it in its entirety, but we're going to talk about the big hits on it. Nearly every employer has equipment that needs to be safeguarded, especially in your maintenance departments. One of my biggest things that I ding maintenance departments on is their abrasive wheel grinders. Most businesses, even if they're an office building, they have a maintenance guy that has to repair things, and he usually needs an abrasive wheel grinder to do some of that work. So I'll talk about that specifically a little later on. But this part of the webinar is going to be an overview of machine guards, but we're going to focus on preventing caught in, compressed by, abraded by, and struck by injuries that involve machines. The standard in its entirety, if you want to see that, is 296.806. That's the standard for machine safety in Washington. Where we see injuries on machines is usually reaching into clear equipment or performing maintenance and not using lockout, tagout while you're doing that, or unauthorized persons doing the maintenance or using machines, as well as missing or loose machine guards. That's another thing that when I do site visits, I find a lot of. I actually think one of those clients is in this webinar today. One of their workers had taken a guard on a saw, and they had pulled it back and duct taped it down so the guard wouldn't close anymore, just because they got annoyed with having to move it. Okay, where are these injuries going to occur? Well, they're going to happen at the point of operation. which is going to be anywhere you have moving machine parts like flywheels, pulleys, belts, couplings, chains, cranks, gears, or feed mechanisms, or anywhere it's going to come and press down or do a cut, anything like that. And then in running nip points, that's going to be where you have two moving parts you can really get pinched in between. So in running nip points is the word they use in the standard instead of calling it a pinch point. But most people are just going to call those a pinch point. And pinch points don't sound bad because if someone pinches you, it doesn't hurt too bad. But a pinch point can actually deglove you or cause an amputation. I've seen instances where a finger's gotten into a pinch point and it has stripped that finger of the meat in the flesh, and all that's remaining is bone. That's known as degloving. And also, you could have your finger get removed or amputated, or the injury could lead to a medical amputation later. So how are we going to safeguard those? We need to prevent contact with the operation point. We need to protect the operator and the other employees in the area and their clothing from hazards. So if you have rotating equipment or moving equipment or pinch points, things like that, your workers should not be wearing headphones. Headphones are something that can get caught in there. Also, hoodie strings. If they have hoodie strings, they should be tied up or tucked inside. Necklaces, rings, all those things can get caught up and pulled into a machine and pull the worker with them. And then coming back to our PPE, before I get any farther, harnesses. Harnesses they're not one size fits all. And when a smaller worker puts on a harness that's too large, they're going to have a lot of extra strap that's hanging out in their adjustment. And if that's not tucked back in, or kept from kind of hanging out freely, if it gets caught in, let's say, a lathe or any other rotating machinery, it's going to pull the worker into there, and that has led to fatalities. Okay, we also need to protect from falling objects, ensure that no objects can fall into moving parts. Okay, so how are we going to or what are some requirements for those safeguards? They cannot create any new hazards. So they can't have any shear points, jagged edges, or unfinished surfaces. We would not want our safeguard to present more of a hazard than the initial hazard itself. And they shouldn't create any interference. This requirement for safeguards is because OSHA and L&I both know that if the safeguard is going to interfere with the worker's not going to use it. They're going to find a way to bypass it. So we want to make sure that it's going to not prevent the worker from performing their job quickly and comfortably. And safeguards should allow for lubrication of the machine without needing them removed. That's where when we get into lockout tagout, we're going to find out that if you have to bypass a safeguard in order to lubricate the machine, you have to shut it down and go through lockout tagout. But oftentimes, especially newer machines are designed so that they can be lubricated or have the routine type maintenance done while they're still running without bypassing safeguards. Those safeguards also need to be secured and attached to the machine or secured somewhere, so essentially so they can't be easily knocked off or taken out of service. In the absence of specific standards, so some things have specific safeguard standards like the abrasive wheel I talked about, but if there isn't a specific standard for it, it needs to be designed and constructed to prevent the operator from having any part of his or her body enter the danger zone. So I copied and pasted that out of L&I. They just say any part of his body entering the danger zone during the operating cycle. The common methods of guarding would be fixed barrier guards. This is what you're used to seeing on your bandsaws and things like that have a guard that doesn't move. Okay. Then we also have adjustable barrier guards. You can also find these on bandsaws, and they can be raised or lowered depending on how big the piece of wood you're sawing would be. Okay. Also interlocking devices. Forklifts often come with interlocks now, and I really encourage employers to have interlocks on their forklifts that require the worker to fasten their seatbelt before they move the device. Most forklifts now will not even turn on unless you have your seatbelt fastened, and they'll automatically shut off if you take the seatbelt off. Remote control and placement, which is where the worker never has to do anything in the machine. They press a button and basically the machine itself will move the part from place to place within the machine, and the worker never has to contact the danger zone. Electronic safety devices, automatic shutdown type things, pressure sensing devices. An example of that would be a worker has to put their hands both on separate buttons so that none of their hands are inside the machine when the machine's running, and if they take their hand off that button, the machine will stop. And light curtains are becoming one of the most cost-effective methods of machine guarding. This is great for if you have any sort of presses or anything that could come down on a worker's hand and crush it, or even conveyor belts, rotating stuff as well, to where if you put a light curtain is a device that emits light on one end and receives light on the other. And if you pass your hand through that light, whether it's a laser or any other sort of light curtain, it's going to shut the machine down. Every single person that has a garage likely has this device if you have an automatic garage door opener. If you press the button on your garage door opener and you have something between the laser lights, it will not shut, it'll stop. And that can be put on just about any machine in your workplace for as little as, I've seen them as cheap as $300 to $800 for a small light curtain. Our last method would be administrative controls. That would be where, let's say we put a barrier and we tell workers you cannot go past that barrier. But the problem with administrative controls is we're relying pretty much on human nature for those to be adhered to. Okay. And I keep mentioning point of operation. What's the point of operation? So let's take this for example, whether you're looking at a meat slicer or in this case, looks like this is something that's cutting metal. The stock would be the metal that arrow is pointing to. The blade's coming down from the top. Your point of operation is right here where my cursor is on the screen, where the blade touches the stock. You don't want your finger to go in there because it's going to get cut off. So that's the point that we need to safeguard and keep workers from getting to. So that would be a great opportunity for a light curtain where if you go past or anywhere near that blade, it's going to automatically stop. There's an example of it's a fixed guard. I wouldn't call that one adjustable. It does move up and down a little bit, but it's just to allow the stock to go through. Okay. And our rotating motion, this needs to be essentially blocked with a cage. Anything that's rotating needs to be blocked with a cage or a wall. You don't want a worker getting anywhere near that. I worked with a factory up in Ohio who had a woman that dropped something, and there was a barrier in place. However, that barrier, it was a set of doors that was normally locked. The maintenance worker, I guess, had lost the lock the last time they did. They had shut it down and gone inside and opened it up. So instead of putting a lock back in place to hold that door shut, they just used tie wire. And so this woman who had dropped something inside the machine took the tie wire off, opened up the doors, crawled underneath it. She had her hair up in a bun. It contacted rotating machinery similar to these little spindles here, and that wrapped her hair up, and it ultimately ended up ripping her hair out and partially scalping her. So you do not want to get anywhere near rotating equipment with any loose clothing, jewelry, or your hair. Okay. Fans are a perfect example of that. So fans are something I run into a lot of times where I've seen citations issued for fans that had large gaps in the cage around them. As silly as that seems, especially this big one that can get going pretty fast with those metal blades, that can take a finger off. Now, I don't expect any workers to try and put their fingers in there, but that's why they come with those cages on them so that workers cannot put their fingers in there. And here's those in-running nip points I talked about, those pinch points you could really get yourself into that could deglove, crush, or amputate a finger or other body part. And then power transmission areas, so areas where we have pulleys and drives running something. If they're less than 7 feet from the floor, they need to be guarded. And that's because we have people that get pretty tall. You know, I'm not a tall guy, but someone who's, you know, let's say 6 foot, if this pulley's 6 feet off the ground and their hair's right there, it's going to grab a hold of their hair and pull them in. So we want to make sure that something like this up here is guarded with a cage or a wall, similar to this. That's a perfect guard for this device right here. This is obviously rotating, and you could still, get your hair wrapped on either side of that. So one of the requirements we would have here is that our workers, if they have long hair, they have to have it pulled back, because if you would lean forward, it could still definitely get wrapped up while this is spinning. But getting a finger or something against this is just like a buffing wheel, isn't really going to do much damage, if any at all. And then a lot of times in your maintenance department, you might have a drill or a small lathe, and it will have or could have transparent shields like this on it, but that's not going to be enough for your workers. This is where you're going to have to combine that with PPE, such as goggles or safety glasses. Okay, as well as if you have any oils or anything in there, that could spray you as well. Okay, there's an example of some shields on a device. This again, I would want, even with that shield down, our worker's going to need to wear safety glasses while running this device. Not sure exactly what they were doing with this one in particular, but we may need to go as far as to incorporate a face shield as well. Then this is the one I always pick on. This is that abrasive wheel guard. It has very strict requirements for this tongue up top and the work rest on the bottom as far as how much distance can be between those and between the bench itself and the abrasive wheel. Okay, and those numbers are right here. The workbench itself can have no more than an opening of 1/8 of an inch. And sorry, my picture looks like it got moved, but the 1/8 of an inch is down here on the bottom between this work rest and the abrasive wheel. No more than 1/8 of an inch, because we don't want fingers to get stuck down in there. And then up top, this is that adjustable tongue guard, can have no more than a 1/4 inch gap in that adjustable tongue guard. Okay. There's your self-adjusting guard. Talked about that earlier. Here's a manual adjusting guard. I mentioned this earlier. With a bandsaw, you can move this guard, this metal guard, up or down depending on the size of the stock you're going to push through it. This is where you need to train your workers, is when you have a manually adjusted guard. When they have something large they need to cut, they're going to raise this guard up. But then what are they going to do once they finish cutting it? They're going to leave it there, and they're going to come in with something smaller. They're going to put their hands on top of that object that's smaller than the last one they cut, and as they push it through, now their fingers are going to be right near that blade. And the guard's not going to be there. They need to drop that guard down when they're working on something smaller. That's why I like self-adjusting better, because the self-adjusting don't allow that room for human error. Also, if you're doing cutting operations, if you're using a saw, you can always use a push stick or a push block to make sure your hands are never near the point of operation. You're using something else to push that through. Okay, this picture takes me back to shop class in middle school. All right. Some standard policies on machine safeguarding would be never place your hands in the point of operation. Okay, even if the machine's turned off. Especially if you're a maintenance worker, especially if the machine's jammed up. I can't tell you how many amputation claims I've seen because a machine, a saw, a blade, anything, even just rotating conveyor belts. Excuse me, sorry, I got hiccups. If that stuff would stop moving because it's jammed, what happens the moment you unjam it? All that torque that's behind there gets set free, and it'll start to rotate, and it will pull your hand, cut your hand, cause an amputation. So never place your hands in the point of operation, even if the machine's turned off. If you have to unblock a jam, you should be doing that with a tool that you're reaching in with, not with your hand itself. Make sure you follow manufacturer procedures for belt, blade, and wheel changes. Always put guards back on after changing tools. Okay. Never attempt to fix or unjam equipment with your hands while it's running, or even when it's not running. I think I mentioned that already, okay, just a couple seconds ago. Make sure you use a tool to fix or unjam it. Don't want to lose a finger. And then understand the controls and safety features of the equipment before you operate it. And if you have questions about equipment, ask. Okay, usually If the operator has a question, the person that can answer their question is the maintenance worker. Usually if the maintenance worker has a question on that piece of equipment, the person they have to reach out to is going to either be a plant manager or ultimately the manufacturer of the equipment itself is where you're going to have to go when you have those high-level questions. Okay. And then the responsibilities of different levels of employees through this in machine safety. Management needs to ensure that the machinery is properly guarded. Supervisors should be training their employees on specific guard rules in their areas. This is where I really rag. I wouldn't say rag on HR, but HR shouldn't have to do this. I've seen too many places that I go into where HR wears the safety hat and HR has to train employees on the safety of everything in the facility. That's not how it should be. HR might go over the high level safety for the plant itself, similar to what you'd go over with me when I come to your plant as a guest or to your workplace. But the supervisors in each department should be training their employees on the specific rules for the equipment in their area of the facility. Because they should be they likely know it much better than the HR person does. Now, if your HR person knows how all those machines work and they're an expert on them, by all means, let them train them. But usually that's not the case. And if you're an HR person watching this webinar, go out there and learn the stuff too, because it's helpful. Because I know a lot of times you end up being ultimately responsible for safety. So it helps to know. Okay. Supervisors need to immediately correct machine guard deficiencies. Okay, and employees are not allowed to remove, alter, or tamper with guards, and they need to report machine guarding problems to their supervisors immediately. So if something's wrong with your machine or the guard on it, you stop work, you report it to the supervisor. Supervisor fixes it or has maintenance fix it, and then the employee can go back to work. It's important that we stop work and do not operate that equipment until those guards are back in place and functioning. Summary on machine guarding. Those safeguards are essential for protecting workers from needless and preventable injuries. And the point of operation, as well as all parts of the machine that move while the machine's working, need to be safeguarded and kept away from people. Okay, distance is not considered enough of a safeguard. You need to put a barrier in between the worker and that rotating equipment. Okay. A good rule to remember is that any machine part, function, or process that could cause injury must be safeguarded. All right. So that was machine guarding. We talked about PPE, talked about machine guarding. Now we're just going to do a very basic high-level overview of lockout, tagout, and then we'll be finished here. Okay, so what's lockout, tagout? L&I's definition is that you place a lockout device on an energy isolating device using an established procedure to make sure the machine or equipment can't be operated. Okay, what's my definition of that? You make sure the machine's shut down. You make sure it's impossible to be turned back on, and the only people that have control of the ability to turn it back on are the people who are working on it. That's what this comes down to. There are procedures you have to go through, and when are you going to use it? Anytime you're servicing or doing maintenance on a machine and equipment in which their unexpected startup or release of stored energy could cause injuries to employees. It applies only to the control of energy during servicing or maintenance of machines or equipment. Okay, so if you're doing normal operations, there's no lockout tagout used. This is only for maintenance and servicing. But if you need to do maintenance and servicing during normal production operations, it's covered by lockout tagout only if the employee is required to remove or bypass a guard like I mentioned earlier, or an employee is required to place any part of his or her body into a danger point of operation, or danger zone. In that case, you need to end normal production and go through lockout, tagout, or at least shut down that part of the system with lockout, tagout, and maybe the rest of the system's running, but that particular area is shut down. The types of energy you need to lock out it's usually electrical for most things, but if anything has a hydraulic, pneumatic, thermal, chemical, stored energy, or other type of energy component, that needs to be locked out as well. But the most common one for most of our clients is going to be electrical. You as an employer need to conduct an evaluation to determine your sources of hazardous energy in your workplace. energy source evaluation should include all equipment and machinery in your shop or your workplace, wherever. Every energy source for each piece of equipment and machinery needs to be documented, okay, so that you know everything that needs to be shut down. So if we're talking about, let's just call it Unit 3 is a big machine that we have. Every energy source going into Unit 3 needs to be documented on its lockout tagout procedure so that when maintenance goes to work on it, they know, okay, for Unit 3, we need to shut down these 3 steam pipes, and we also need to shut down at the breaker. We need to lock out at the breaker this breaker number, as well as the magnitude of each energy source. So how much pressure is in the lines and what do we need to drop it down to? How many volts are running through that circuit to this machine that we're locking out? Okay, and then the location of any energy isolating devices for those energy sources. So for your breaker locks, where are those at? Where are your valve covers? Those should all be stored in a central area, and that should be listed on your lockout tagout instruction. All right, so this is a simple example of evaluating your sources of energy. So if we had electrical, the magnitude for it would be typically 3-phase 220, and that's the breaker box on the wall. And then if we had a thermal component, say it's normally 500 degrees, we need to just allow that to cool. And then what would be better is if we would say allow it to cool to a certain temperature. We should have that temperature listed that we want it to cool to. Whoops, those came in late up top. There we go. All right, so written procedures do need to be documented for each piece of equipment that you have. If your machinery or piece of equipment are similar, just one procedure can cover all like pieces. I know I'm down to, I think, 3 minutes left in our scheduled time here. I've only got about 9 slides to go, so this isn't going to take us too much longer. Okay, your general lockout tagout procedures are going to include the following. You need to notify any employees that are going to be affected. Affected employees are people working in the vicinity of the machine that you're shutting down, operators of the machine that you're shutting down, and people who might be receiving product at the other end of the machine that you're shutting down. Okay, so you need to notify everyone that could be affected. And then after that, so when I say you, I'm talking about the maintenance worker that is authorized to do lockout, tagout, and work on the machine. That maintenance worker is then going to shut down all those energy sources that we had listed. Then they're going to apply lockout devices. I'm going to have photos of those coming up in a couple slides, but those are essentially, you take a padlock that is only used for lockout tagout, so maybe you have red padlocks designated for that or something similar. You're going to apply that device so that nobody else can unlock it or take it out of that state. And then before we work on it, we need to test to verify our energy sources are locked out. And not only that, but that the energy has been dissipated. There could be stored energy in that system, so we're going to try to turn it back on. Okay, and then when we try to turn it back on, if it doesn't work, we're going to switch it back down to off. That's what we want to have happen. If we test it and it turns on and then shuts back off quickly, we're going to try to test it a couple more times to make sure that was just maybe some stored energy leaving the system. But if we turn it on and it runs and keeps running, we have a problem. That means we did not properly lock it out and tag it out. Okay, so we need to make sure we go back and check to see what's powering it now. Once we verify it's been locked out, now we can conduct our maintenance work. Once we're done conducting our maintenance work, then we can notify those affected employees to say, hey, Jimmy, Susie, we're turning this back on. Make sure you're clear of the area. You don't have anything near the machine because it's going to start running now. So we make sure Jimmy and Susie, our affected employees, aren't there anymore. We go turn it on, and now it should be running properly, and those employees can get back to work. Okay. So I already mentioned those authorized or the affected employees are the ones that are typically using the machine, but the authorized ones are your maintenance workers that are going to be working on it. Okay, they need to be trained to perform lockout tagout for all the devices they're going to be using it on. And then the affected employees lastly are those that are just working on it. I should have switched those 2 slides. I'm going to do that for next time. Okay. Those affected employees need to be trained to the awareness level. Basically what we're doing right now is awareness level. We're letting folks know what the hazards are, how we lock out and tag out a machine, and why we're doing it. And that's about it, just that they are not supposed to use or touch that machine while it's locked out and tagged out. Okay. So those affected employees, like I said, just general awareness training on lockout, tagout regulations and your company policies on it. But your authorized employees need all that general awareness training plus training on the types of energy, magnitude of energy sources, locations and how to lock out those energy sources, and the types of devices that are going to be used by your company to lock out. Okay. Quite a few maintenance departments lack this training formally. A lot of the maintenance workers know how to do all this stuff because they've done it elsewhere or they've just kind of been trained without it being documented. You should definitely document lockout, tagout training awareness and authorized level, the affected and authorized level of the training. Definitely document that because this is where some serious injuries can really happen. Most of the serious injuries I see in claims are oftentimes maintenance workers that were doing something related to lockout, tagout. I see that a lot. Okay. Make sure you do retraining anytime you have a change in procedure, job assignment, or a new hazard, or you get new equipment in, because that new equipment's going to have different lockout, tagout procedures. Anytime you find deviations from established procedures, if you're doing an audit and you realize that they're not properly locking out and tagging out things before they do maintenance, that's a huge red flag. Most places that is not retraining. Most places that is going to be an immediate termination if someone's violating a lockout, tagout rule. That's extremely dangerous. When an employee is observed not following procedures, it's another time you'd retrain or honestly get rid of them. When I was out on the pipeline, if you would violate a lockout tagout rule, you were instantly kicked off the job site and you were then blacklisted, not allowed to work for any of for the gas company or any of their contractors. They took that real seriously because lockout tagout, a mistake there is a fatality most of the time. Make sure you standardize your locks and tags. They should identify the user and they should be durable. This is a good example. So we see these red locks. Those should only be used for lockout, tagout. Some companies use purple. I don't care what you use as long as your workers know that that color is for lockout, tagout. And this tag here, or even sometimes people do it on the lock. They'll have a place where the worker can write their name on the lock so that they know, okay, that's Jim's lock. I need to get a hold of Jim if I need to use this machine to ask him if he's done working on it, etc. Okay, and they shouldn't be used for other things. I've gone into workplaces and seen their lockout, tagout locks being used on normal lockers to store stuff. You can't do that. Only for lockout, tagout, those locks. No employee shall attempt to operate any switch, valve, or other energy isolating device that's locked out. No employee shall bypass any guard or engineering control without following the lockout, tagout procedures. If you have group lockout, tagouts and multiple people working on it, we come back to this slide. That's what this guy here is for. Each one of those holes you can put another lock in so you can get a group. Let's say you're in a refinery, you need to have 20 people going into a space. They make boxes that you can attach that many locks to. Okay. And then if you have a shift change, oftentimes I tell people if there's a shift change, the new shift puts their locks on it, the old shift takes theirs off and it stays locked out. You just transfer it. But everyone should use their own locks. But you should have your own shift change policy in place for lockout, tagout. And lastly is lock removal. A lock should never ever be removed by anyone other than the user except under very strict circumstances, such as the worker became unwell or got injured and has been removed from the job site. We know he's gone due to that. The worker quit and left their lock on there. That's another time we would need to remove a lock that's not our own. In both cases, the highest ranking safety person or highest ranking plant official needs to verify that that person is not in or near the machine, verify that person's location is a safe place, then cut the lock off and turn it back on, but make sure you document in writing all of that previous information before you cut that lock. Okay, quite a few of the slides or content on this presentation came directly from Washington Labor and Industries or OSHA's Office of Training and Education, all of which were used for free use. We didn't charge for this presentation, so I appreciate y'all coming and spending some time with me today. I know we only had a handful watching, but I think we had about 30 register. So again, this will stay posted at this exact link. You can come back and watch it at any time free of charge. The reason we have you register is so that we know who in the group is participating in these safety activities, and we do keep track of that, so we appreciate you participating today. If you have any questions, you can email me, john.valentine@yorkris.com. You can ask them over here in the chat box right now. If you're watching this recording and it's not October 11th at 3 p.m. right now, then I'm not going to be monitoring the chat box. You need to email me. Make sure you connect with me on LinkedIn. I post a lot of safety articles there on LinkedIn. And also, of course, check out the Compwise Safety Library, careworks.com/statefund-tpa/compwise-training. That is where we house this webinar and quite a few others, as well as all of our toolbox talks, and you can find that PPE hazard assessment there. Okay, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to copy this and I'm going to put that in the chat box so that y'all have it. Maybe. Yep, there we go. Post it in the chat box. I'm also going to post it as a public comment. And I will end up editing the description of this video and putting it there as well. So again, thanks for coming out. Thanks for participating today. And keep an eye out for some more exciting webinars coming up in the future. We're hoping to put together one for OSHA record keeping for early next year, possibly late this year. I think that one, I've been getting a lot of questions on OSHA record keeping, so we're going to put that together. If you have a topic you'd like to hear about, there is a submission box at that CareWorks State Fund Compwise training URL I sent you. There's a suggestion box there, or you could just, again, email me directly if you have any topics you'd like information on, a webinar on, or a toolbox talk on. So thanks again. Have a great weekend.